I'm here with a video showing you how I made the cropped shirt for my Aloy cosplay. If you would like to skip patterning, I do have all of these patterns available on my store Envy and Etsy, as well as an ebook that they pair with, which will give you step-by-step instructions and photos to match. But for now, let's get on to the list of materials you'll need. So you won't need a lot of materials for this. You'll just need some light brown suede fabric and some light brown embroidery floss, and then your normal sewing supplies such as a sewing machine, needle, thread, scissors, etc. And that's pretty much it. I'll have a list of all the materials in the description below, but for now, let's get on with the crafting. I couldn't find footage of me cutting out the pieces, but that is the first step I took aside from drafting up my patterns. I just used an old pattern I had from a previous project and altered it a bit to create the patterns for Aloy's top. After that, I had pinned all of the panel pieces of my top together, which is what I'm showing that I've done here. Only the shoulder seam should be left open at the moment, or left unpinned at the moment. The top isn't very fitted and the neck hole is big enough to fit over my head, so there is no need for a zipper anywhere. It's just sewing all of the panel pieces together, nothing else to worry about. I used a straight stitch to sew together all of the top pieces and backstitched at both the start and end of each line to secure the stitching. Next, I pinned the shoulder seams together and sewed those down. Each sleeve was divided into two halves to help them curve over the shoulders, so I pinned the sleeve pieces together along the center seam and sewed that down. There is no bottom seam since the sleeves don't wrap all the way around the arm. I fold over the bottom raw edges of both the sleeves and sew that down to create an almost finished edge. I've only folded it over once because I'll be folding it over again to completely finish and conceal that raw edge in a little bit. However, around the neckline and armholes, I fold over the raw edges twice and sew those down to create a finished edge and completely conceal the raw edges. Be sure to fold over inwards when you're folding over these edges, by the way. You don't want this on the outside, you want all of the stitching and seams tucked away on the inside of the garment. I had originally stitched down the bottom edge of the top too, but I didn't like how that looked, so I decided to use an iron-on hem adhesive to finish that edge instead. I followed the directions on the package for this. I also used this to finish the sleeves bottom edges as well. So only the armhole and neckline will have visible stitching around them when this top is finished, although it's not very visible when worn, which is why I didn't bother to use hem adhesive in those areas. Plus, I felt trying to get hem adhesive to lay flat and finish the hem around such curved areas might have been a little bit tricky, so I was fine leaving the stitching for the arm and neck holes, but I didn't want the stitching in very visible places like around the bottom of the shirt or the bottom of the sleeves. The directions called for a damp rag, and water doesn't always mix well with this type of fabric, so I made sure to only place the rag on the inside of the shirt and avoided doing so on the front, just in case the water did make anything go weird with this fabric. In the end, nothing happened. It was actually fine, so I guess a damp rag isn't the worst thing ever, but just in case, I would recommend only letting the wet rag touch the inside of the shirt and not the outside. Next, it was time to attach the sleeves. When looking at a reference photo, you'll notice the sleeves kind of overlap the armholes and aren't actually sewn into it. Instead, they're sewn a few inches back from it, and the front of the sleeve lines up with this side seam on the front of the shirt. It's not the direct side, it's like the front side, or front like off-centered from the center. There's a seam between what would be the center of the front and the side seam, like the direct side seam. There's a seam there. I think it might be called like a princess seam or something like that, but don't quote me on that. Anyways, the sleeves run into that seam and start running along it, like they meet up. So I lined the center seam of the sleeves up with the shoulder seam at the top, a few inches back from the armholes, and started pinning them down, making sure that on the front side it ran into that princess seam, possible princess seam. I don't know the exact name for this seam. Anyways, on the back, I just tried to make it look like as even with the front as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, just make sure that you're not pulling it too far back on the back, because you'll find that you might end up tightening the sleeves too much and you won't really be able to raise your arms. So if you do find that it is too tight and you need to move the sleeves forward, mostly move it forward on the back and move it forward as much as possible on the front without having it not be able to line up with that front side seam. Once I was happy with the placement, I top stitched that down, getting as close to the edge as possible. After that, it was time to work on the details. I started off by using fabric chalk to mark where I wanted to make the little slits that are cut into the bottom edges of the sleeves. Then I cut those out, trying to match up the sizes with what I saw in reference photos. After that, I sealed each cutout with Fray Check to keep it from fraying, because this fabric loves to fray. Now it was time to start embroidering. I used a roller and marked small dots where I wanted the stitches to go along the bottom of the shirt. I made the stitches 3/8 of an inch apart and 3/4 of an inch long. So the dots would be placed 3/8 of an inch apart from each other and 3/4 of an inch up from the very bottom of the shirt. Sew the stitches so that they are going straight up and down on the outside, and then wrap around the bottom of the shirt into the inside of the shirt, and then on the inside they'll go at a slight diagonal. Hopefully this plus the video makes sense. Occasionally I will iron everything down using my iron on a low heat setting, just to make sure that the embroidery floss is staying in place and not shifting too much, because it will kind of want to shift around, and I found that ironing it down kept it in place better. Next, I stitched the X-shape pattern that goes up either front side seam of the shirt. So again, not the very side, but the two possibly called princess seams of the shirt that you can see here. This goes up and around to the back of the sleeve. Where it ends at the back is where this X pattern stops as well. To keep the X's even, I used a ruler and marked dots on the inside of the shirt that were 1/2 of an inch apart going up and down, and placed 1/4 of an inch from the seam on either side. Again, occasionally I would iron all of these down just to make sure that the embroidery was staying nice and neat and not getting shifted around or anything like that. Also, I wanted to note that when you are embroidering this top, to not pull on the thread too tightly, because this doesn't need to be super tight. This is purely decorative. If you pull on it too tight, it can cause the fabric to kind of bunch up and gather, and you want to avoid that. It just needs to sit flat with the fabric, nice and a little bit loose, but not so loose that it just looks kind of floppy sitting there. Just tight enough to lay flat with the fabric. The back seam has stitches that line the back going straight across horizontally and then up and down the seam. That means on the inside of the shirt, the stitches are going to go at a bit of a diagonal. Again, I used a ruler to mark the dots on the inside of the shirt to help keep my stitches even. I placed the dots so that they were 3/8 of an inch apart going up and down the center seam, and 3/8 of an inch apart from the center seam on either side. Like with all of the other seams, I ironed it as needed to keep the embroidery floss laying nice and flat and kind of help it stay in place. Next, I embroidered the sleeves. I added the stitching along the edges the same way that I did with the bottom of the top. They were just shorter. I also want to note that occasionally I spaced the stitches on both the bottom of the sleeves and the bottom of the shirt out a bit differently. Like sometimes I would place them closer together or further apart, or make them connect to one another at an angle just to match the imperfections I've seen in reference photos. It's supposed to look hand-sewn, so it doesn't have to be perfect all the time. I just mostly wanted them to keep spaced apart evenly. After that, I did the same thing with the X-shaped stitching up the center of the sleeves that I did on the center front side seam pieces. It's exactly the same as that. And then I finished it off by embroidering the half circle or circular designs she has on her sleeves. I drew up a template for this and traced it out onto the inside of the shirt using some fabric chalk, and from there I just mostly eyeballed the stitching. I tried to just kind of keep the stitching even, but I wasn't too picky with it because it doesn't look perfect on the reference photos, so I wasn't trying to make it perfectly symmetrical or even or anything like that. I mostly just wanted to keep the length of the stitches the same, and the spacing could vary. It's basically just a bunch of short straight lines that make up these circular shapes. The inner circle has stitches that are pretty close together, while the outer circle is made up of stitches that are placed further apart. And that is it. That is how I made the crop shirt for my Aloy cosplay. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day and bye!